Happy Friday afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the H&H Debriefing. Heather and I are here today. Jen's off, having fun. Yay, Jen. And one thing that we wanted to talk about today is the first time that our community members identified as romance readers. It's a question we posed on the site, and then we got a ton of responses on our Twitter feed. Most people were saying that probably around age 10, 11, 12, and in their teen years was when they first started. Heather, when's the first time you identified as a romance reader?
I've talked about this a little before in comments on the site, but I actually started reading romance when I was 11, and it all just happened because I was at a store with my mom, bothering her that I didn't have anything to read. She hands me a Mary Jo Putney book, One Perfect Rose, and I devour it, and I immediately identified as a romance reader. But I thought your post was so interesting because while people might have been reading romance for a long time, they might not have seen themselves as romance readers. And I think that's really interesting. It makes sense in a lot of ways that you might read romance but not really want to share that with anyone. I know that in my teen years, I would read them, and in public even, but, as soon as someone started to act closed-minded about it or something, I would try to change the subject or avoid it or whatever. So I could totally understand why you wouldn't necessarily think of yourself as a romance reader, but more as someone who occasionally reads romance. So the comments have been fantastic, and we hope that everyone weighs in and shares their experience.
I know for me, it wasn't even so much not identifying as a romance reader or not. I thought I was reading history, or that I was reading historical stuff that happened to have a romance. For example, and I'm wearing my Jane Eyre shirt, I read Jane Eyre and was completely obsessed with the Jane and Rochester story, but didn't really realize that I was reading a romance per se, and I kept reading all those great works of literature that had really strong romances in them, and that's what I read for. But I didn't self-identify as a romance reader until much later. And I was even reading Barbara Cartland's. Those were my first foray. And speaking of Barbara Cartland and Mary Jo Putney, there's been a lot of discussion about how the historical is dying in popular readers' minds, that they're not reading as much historicals. And we disagree. We don't think historicals are dying, and in fact we're seeing some more historical set in eras that previously were forbidden in the 20th century, maybe spurred on by Downton Abbey and even World War I and World War II. And Heather has some thoughts about World War II set romances which differ greatly from mine. So Heather?
I do. Well, we've talked about this a little bit before, and probably in comments as well, but I think that historical is far from dead. I think that it just needs something new and fresh to kind of reboot things and get everyone really excited again. And I think that one of the possibilities is that a new time period will really break out for people. If someone finds the right way into that time period, it might really break out. And I know that a colleague and I are big fans of history, and World War II, I've actually seen some successful romances set in that time period. I mentioned to Megan that I really love Suzanne Brockman's SEAL Team 16 books, which tended to have a B story that took place during World War II, and there were often some really lovely romances set side by side with a romantic suspense storyline, and I loved those. I ate them up, and so I definitely think there's a possibility for more romances set in a time period like that, and I think that it could really kind of help bring historicals back into the spotlight for romance. So we'll see. Someone has to do something, I guess, really different. I think sort of like 50 Shades, for better or worse, did for contemporary and erotic romance. I think something similar will happen with historical, which is not to say there are not amazing Regency romances still being written. I still love them. I adore them. But I think that it will probably be something completely different that will really kind of rise to the very top and explode like 50 Shades did. So
I absolutely agree, and I actually think I think one of the things that is probably going to break out once somebody does it is a super sexy, like erotic historical. I know I've seen little hints of those, and I feel like that's probably the way to get those types of books in front of people's eyes that wouldn't normally read historical. If you give them something that they really want, like super hot erotic stuff, they'll take the history, and then maybe they'll find they enjoy being in a different world. So that's just what I think.
And just a quick thought too. I think that the same goes for any subgenre that's kind of in a lull. It just takes something new and different to break out. I was just thinking, has horror romance ever really worked? But
yeah,
I would
no, it
totally do
hasn't.
that.
But it's sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go ahead. Go
But
ahead.
I know I know that it's kind of been on the edges for a little bit, horror romance, and I know that there's been like little fresh waves of it coming up, and I think that even Samhain has, I think it's Samhain, might have a subprint of horror under their umbrella, and so I think that that might be really interesting because it's certainly graphic and visceral and appealing for people.
And
So
I mean, if you mix that in with paranormal or urban fantasy, I mean, there's your way to kind of reboot the. I keep using that word today, but there's your way. Excuse me. There's your way to kind of reboot, paranormal. You just never know where it's going to come from. This fresh inspiration. So
yeah.
we'll be following that very closely. And on a related historical note, we're very excited to say that we heard today that Starz has already renewed Outlander for season 2. And of course, season 2 will follow book 2 in the series, which is Dragonfly and Amber. So we'll be very curious to see how Ron Moore follows that book, because there are some very interesting things that go on in that book. And we are excited to check that out.
Yep, very much so, and that means I'm going to have to read Dragonfly and Amber too,
Yeah, and
which I
I'll have
haven't
to
read.
refresh my memory on that. It's been a
Yeah,
while, but there are definitely some very interesting things that if he adapts it as closely as he is the first book, will be very interesting to see. So,
cool.
without giving anything away.
Okay, spoiler girl.
I try. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us Friday, August 15th, and we'll see you next week. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.